So I'll hand over to Bianca to get started with GraphQL through Gatsby JS. So floor is all yours, Bianca.
Thanks, Paul. Cool. So my name is Bianca. I'm a full stack Rails and React dev. I've been in industry since July last year. So however many months that is, about 9 months now. And at my previous company, when I was first going into industry, one of the first things that I got given to work on was the company website, and it was a Gatsby app. And I'd never really worked with Gatsby before. And I definitely had not worked with GraphQL before. But basically, by getting familiar with this Gatsby app and getting across how that worked, I found that it was actually a really great introduction to GraphQL, which was what gave me the idea for this talk. So that's where I'm coming from. But what is Gatsby? So Gatsby is basically a static site generator. Static site generators come in many different flavors. There are all kinds of different ones in different languages. And Gatsby is becoming increasingly popular, I would say, probably because it's React-based. So if you've worked with React.js, which is a popular JavaScript front-end framework, then picking up Gatsby is pretty straightforward. Gatsby uses GraphQL to manage complex data. That's kind of one of the big selling points of Gatsby. And I've got this URL here, which I'm just going to flick over to very quickly. Gatsby's page on why you might want to use Gatsby, because I just want to highlight this that they've got there quite prominently, which is that Gatsby is all about having this unified data layer. So enabling developers to easily get data from many different sources that they might want to get data from and combine it together in a way that is really easy to work with. And basically it uses GraphQL for that. So let's come back over here and talk very briefly about GraphQL. So this is the GraphQL meetup, and this talk in particular is very much aimed at people who are fairly new to GraphQL. So for anyone who's worked with it before, these are going to be things that you already know. But GraphQL is basically, it's called a specification for querying data. So what's a specification? Basically, that's some general guidelines on how to query data and how to do it in a really efficient way. GraphQL is great because it allows us to be very specific about exactly what data we want to get back, and to basically say, hey, we want to get this very specific bit of data, and then that's what we get back. We ask and we receive very specific bits of data through GraphQL. So as we kind of saw on the Why Gatsby page, Gatsby uses GraphQL basically whenever we want to get data from Gatsby. We're going to be using GraphQL. It gives us a nice, efficient, predictable way of getting our data, regardless of what kind of data it is and where it's coming from, because it all comes through that unified data layer of GraphQL. So it can be used to call GraphQL APIs directly, but also there are many different Gatsby plugins that are available to get non-GraphQL data into Gatsby, and then to use GraphQL to query it through our Gatsby application. So everything basically ends up as GraphQL for us to query. So I just want to really emphasize this point that wherever our data may have come from, whatever format it may have come to us in, once we get it into our Gatsby site, we're going to be able to query it in the same way, regardless of where it came from, regardless of what it is. We'll be able to query it through GraphQL. So Gatsby is very much focused around GraphQL as its unifying data layer. So some of the things that I think make Gatsby a really great way to get started with GraphQL are that you can really quickly spin up a Gatsby app and get started with it, and you've got some GraphQL queries in there already. So in a few minutes, I'll flick over to VS Code and we'll have a look at a very simple starter Gatsby app. But basically, by doing very little, you've already got a working app that's easy to understand and that you can play with the GraphQL queries with, which is really, really cool. There are also some really good learning resources for Gatsby that will allow you to get across Gatsby, but also because GraphQL is so fundamental to how Gatsby works, a lot of the Gatsby learning resources that are really good are also a really good explanation of how to understand GraphQL as well. So I'd say that's a pretty good reason to try and learn GraphQL through Gatsby as well. So GraphQL, we'll see what that is in a minute, but basically it's a way to try out and to build GraphQL queries. And there are many different ways to do that. GraphQL is the one that's built into Gatsby. So it's kind of already there and ready to go for you, as we'll see in a minute. And in terms of tech stacks, it's a static site generator. Gatsby's a static site generator. So it's a reasonably simple tech stack, which again is another sort of plus for if what you're really wanting to do is to understand GraphQL. Doing it in a tech stack that's fairly simple overall is a good way to go. So let's have a quick look at the basic structure of a GraphQL query before we jump into having a look at the Gatsby app. So basically we will name our query. So whatever the name of the query will be. Then we're going to specify the content that we want to query. Then we'll have edges, which are basically a collection of items that are related to each other. And then we're going to go down deeper into that again, and we're going to retrieve a node, which is a single item. And then that single item is going to have multiple different properties. And this particular node might have 10 or many different properties, but we can specify with our GraphQL query just the properties that we want, and we'll only get back the properties that we're after. So we can get very, very granular and only get back what we actually want with GraphQL, which is very cool. So that's a bit abstract. Let's look at an example of exactly that, but a GraphQL query in Gatsby. My syntax highlighting is going a bit weird on my slide there, but hopefully this still makes sense. So this is exactly the same structure as what we saw on the previous slide, but an example in Gatsby. So we've got the name of our query, in this case, all pages. So this is an actual Gatsby query that's there in probably every Gatsby site, certainly every standard Gatsby site, to give us all the pages that are available. The content that we want to query, so all site page is what Gatsby will call it, to query all of the pages in our Gatsby application. Our collection of related items, in this case, is our pages. And so we've got that edges thing there, and that's going to be the pages of our application. And then a single page will be a node. And then there are lots of different properties that we can access on a single page. So ID and path are kind of fairly common ones, but depending on the app, there'll be lots of different things we can access. But again, we're only going to ask for whatever we want and get back what we actually want to use. Cool. So I'm going to jump over to an example app in a moment. The example app that I'm going to use is from the Gatsby Getting Started tutorial. So just close what I had open earlier. So on GitHub, the Gatsby.js tutorial example, I've literally just cloned that and got it running on my machine as a very simple one to look through. And that actually goes through this tutorial. So in the documentation, there's quite a good tutorial on how to get started with Gatsby. And this tutorial app that I'm looking through today is just the finished example of that. There's also, I'll just point out, a really great Gatsby starter library, which has many different examples that all have GraphQL queries built into them. So it's another great way to go and look at different GraphQL queries in a Gatsby app if you'd like to. But for now, let me find VS Code. Cool. So as I said, literally have just cloned down the Gatsby tutorial starter app and got it running on my machine, and that's all I've done. So I haven't made any changes to it or anything like that. So if you're following along at home, it'll be exactly the same as what's in that repo. Before we look at the code, let's go over to the terminal, and I'm going to run Gatsby develop to spin up this app. So it's going to start the server and spin up the application. Shouldn't take too long because it's a pretty small app. And then what we see is that it actually gives us 2 localhost URLs that we're interested in. So this one here is our localhost. So this is, if I go there, it's just what the application is. Very simple blog app with some demo blog posts. So we've got our home, about, and our blog that has different posts in it. What's in the posts is really not that important, but it is what we're going to have a look at with the GraphQL queries in a minute. So that's basically all the site is. It's just a super simple blog. But it's also giving us this thing here. So localhost 8000 / GraphQL. If we open that up, that is what is going to give us this thing here, which is GraphQL. And it's set up to allow us to actually explore some GraphQL queries, which is really cool. So if I very quickly go back over to my slide deck and we have a look at this GraphQL query that I pulled up earlier, let's actually replicate that in our live app. So we're going to look for all pages and the all site pages. First of all, let's see how we'd even get there. How do we even find that in our application? So in GraphQL, over here on the left, there's a thing called the GraphQL Explorer, which allows us to sort of click on stuff and start building our query. So we can actually, in this middle box here, come in here and clear this out and start typing and create a query. But I think when we're just learning how to do it in particular, being able to click on stuff and have it start to generate that query for us is really powerful. So what was I looking for? I was looking for all site page. So let's find that over here on the left, all site page. Cool. I'm going to open that. And in that middle pane here, it's actually populated that for me. It's also, might just zoom that in slightly. It's also giving me some red underlining here, and it's telling me that there's an error. It's actually really helpful. It tells you if you're putting something in here that's invalid. It's telling me that this needs subfields. Yeah, that's cool. I was planning to put some in, so that's fine. So within there, I want to find edges and node, and then pull out some properties there. So I'm in all site page, and I want edges, node. So just as I click on these things, it's going to populate them for me. And let's do what I did in the example. Let's get the ID and the path. Cool. So it's not giving me any errors. That looks fine. I will hit the play button, or the execute button, but play button's more fun. I'll hit the play button, and over on the right-hand side, we can see that it's actually telling me what that query will return if I run it in my application. So just to take a step back for a moment, over here, I'm running localhost 8000. So this is my server, my Gatsby server that I started up. On localhost 8000, we can see the blog running, and then this localhost 8000 / GraphQL is just a way, and it's a nice interface for us to try out the queries that are available on this site that we're running over here. So we'll see some 404 pages and things that are there that are sort of behind the scenes and available, but to relate it to what we saw over on the actual running application, we can see that there's an about page, there's the homepage, there's a blog, and then the blog has yet another post, and my first post. So if we have a look at the blog, yet another post, and my first post. Cool. So we're getting back that data there, and we can kind of play around with the queries and we can explore it. So if we have a look at that, and then we want to sort of explore further what we've got, why don't we go to the code now and have a look at where we can actually find some GraphQL queries in the code. So in VS Code, if I go and do a search for GraphQL, I could just search for GraphQL, but GraphQL backtick is how the GraphQL queries start in a Gatsby app. So knowing that, I can go and search for it, and I can see where these come up in my application. So let's do a real quick tour of some. There are only 4 results that are showing up in this simple app. But basically, I can see here that we've got this. There are different types of queries, and that's beyond the scope of this talk, but we've got this static query here where it's querying site metadata title. We've got this one here where it's actually the same query. We've got this one here that's getting a little bit more interesting, and it's querying the front matter of the pages, which is cool. And then we've got this one here that's, what's this one? This one is the blog index page, and it's querying for what the information that it needs from the available blog pages to populate the blog index page. So another way that it can be really good to use Gatsby to kind of get a feel for GraphQL is to grab one of these queries. So I'm going to grab this very simple query here where it's going site metadata title. I'm going to go back to my wrong browser. I'm going to go back to my thing here. And this time I'm not going to use this Explorer on the side, although I could. I'm going to just clear out what I had and paste it in. And then I can click this thing to help it will tidy up the formatting. And then if I hit play on that one, I can see that this is giving me back this data site metadata title. So it's a really cool way to be able to explore things. If I wanted to see what else is available, I could go into the Explorer or other ways, but I can also just shortcut of control space will show me what other things I've got available to me here, which is just a cool feature of GraphQL. So description is also a thing that's available, and there is no description specified in this app, but if there was, it would show up there as well. So basically, I think I'm out of time, but basically by a combination of kind of exploring Gatsby applications that already exist and using the tools that Gatsby gives us out of the box, we can really quite nicely go in and explore these different GraphQL queries that we can use. We can start using them to then build out a Gatsby application, and something like this can quickly become quite a sophisticated application, and we can explore quite sophisticated queries in GraphQL, all through a very simple static site with a Gatsby app. So if this is sounding cool to you, then some resources I would recommend are basically the official Gatsby tutorial is really, really good. So there's both a quick start guide and a full tutorial. If you're getting started with GraphQL, I recommend the actual tutorial. Part 4 of that is specifically about querying for data with GraphQL, and it's really good. There's also a specific how-to guide on the Gatsby site for querying data, which goes even deeper into GraphQL. And that site recommends, but I also recommend the full stack tutorial for GraphQL is pretty good as well. So that's where I go next if you're wanting to explore GraphQL and you're just getting started with it. So that's all from me. And yeah, if there are any questions, then that's awesome. Thanks for listening.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Bianca. Does anyone have any questions for Bianca? First of all, ask people that are in person. Anyone? Yep. Just give me a sec.
Great talk, Bianca. Really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
I've read a little bit about Gatsby recently, and I wonder, what's your opinion on using Gatsby today versus something like Next.js or Remix?
Yeah, it's a great question. I don't have a great deal of experience with Remix in particular. Is not something that I'm properly across. I can't really give an informed opinion on it. But what I would say is that Gatsby certainly does use modern technology in terms of it really being based around React, GraphQL, that kind of thing. If you kind of are looking to spin up something new, then I think doing your research on what's the best thing for the job is definitely good. But certainly in terms of just using it as something to learn a new technology, I reckon Gatsby is pretty good for that.
Cool. Does anyone else in person have any questions? No? All right, I'll throw it to our friends online. I can see that there's something in the chat, perhaps. Lyndon, looks like you've got a question. Do you want to unmute yourself and ask it?
Yeah, sure. Can you hear me coming through?
I can hear you, yeah.
Yeah. So I heard you mention that Gatsby kind of like can pull data from all kinds of different sources. So what's the kind of like weirdest place you've ever seen someone pull data from for a Gatsby app?
That's a cool question. I can't really think of a weird place. I think, anywhere you can get data from it's possible to make it work with this, I suppose. But Paul, do you want to throw it to the audience? Has anybody seen a weird place that that data's being pulled from?
A TXT file? Is that possible?
TXT file, was it?
Yeah.
Have you seen that?
Yeah.
Wow, okay. Yep.
Graph database. The graph database.
Graph database, yep.
Is it kind of weird?
Is it weird? Graph database?
Kind of weird.
Kind of weird to use GraphQL at a graph database? Opinions? Shrug.
Probably depends how you're using it, right?
Depends what's in there, yeah.
Anyone else?
I have a question.
Oh, yeah, just a second.
Oh, I think people don't necessarily appreciate that you can source data from other GraphQL APIs or REST APIs. So that's always a good one.
Yeah,
Maybe not
that's a
so
good point.
weird.